Welcome back to The Right Angle, the podcast for fantasy readers, writers, and anyone who loves a good story. Hi, I'm Autumn.
And I'm Adrienne. In this episode, we're diving into one of our all-time favorite tropes, fairy tale retellings. We'll be breaking down what really defines a retelling versus a reimagining, sharing some of our favorite examples, and highlighting a few standout books that really seem to give these tales new life.
The majority of the episode today is going to be Adrienne and I talking about different fantasy retellings, specific types, and breaking down the core ideas of those various retellings, as well as giving several examples. But before we get into that, I think it's really important to go over what a fantasy retelling is. And for the sake of brevity, in this episode specifically, we are not going to be talking about any mythological retellings, so nothing with any of the gods of various religions. We're more so specifically looking to talk about the fairy tale retellings that you grew up with. So think Disney movies. A lot of the old classic Disney movies are themselves fantasy retellings, and a lot of the Grimm's fairy tales, Hans Christian Andersen, all of those kind of fairy tales are what we're going to mostly stick to today.
First, we're going to kind of clarify what the difference is between a retelling versus a reimagining. This is definitely not a professional definition of each of these, but this is just how I think of them personally. A retelling, in my mind, sticks close to the core story and doesn't change a lot. They change details and, characters' names and everything, but the plot points are very similar and they stick to the original story. A reimagining of a fairy tale to me is a couple of different things. It can either be just a retelling, but very loosely based on the original story, sometimes so loosely that you don't even realize it's supposed to be based on a fairy tale until much later. And then I also think that a reimagining can be going into a different character than the main character in the original story. For example, the live-action Maleficent movie that goes more into Maleficent's story and her backstory rather than just Princess Aurora.
In my mind, a lot of times reimaginings kind of expand on the story in a different route. So a lot of times, as Adrienne was saying, they'll focus in on a different character. So rather being from the point of view of Cinderella or a character who is standing place for Cinderella, it'll tell the story from someone else, say like one of the evil stepsisters, or maybe someone who's not involved in a fairy tale at all. So I think a good example of this is the Land of Stories series by Chris Colfer. In this series, the two main characters are two kids who are transported into this fantasy world where they meet and interact with characters from different fairy tales. We see them interact with the Frog Prince, which had its own kind of retelling in Disney's Princess and the Frog. We have Cinderella and Rapunzel and Snow White and all of these characters that appear in this story, and the plot of a lot of these books kind of falls similar to different fairy tales, but they're different enough and they're expanded upon significantly enough that it goes beyond just a retelling, because the plot, I think, is what is the biggest part, is the plot is very, very different. Another way to do this is having essentially alternate endings to your classic fairy tales. And this is something that I think we're seeing Disney do. So for those of you who don't know, Disney has a book series. They're making them about a lot of their different movies, and it's basically like, what if the ending of this movie went different? Or sometimes it's not even the ending. What if this thing was tweaked? And I think they do a really good job of having both retellings and reimaginings in this book series. I've read 2 of those so far, one of them being The Little Mermaid, and basically that one is, what if Ariel didn't win in the end and she ended up losing her voice forever. And so that one takes place after the story of The Little Mermaid. And it basically, that one I would say is more of a reimagining because it's not retelling the same story. It has the same characters and a lot of the same situations, but it is very, very different. While I've also read the Beauty and the Beast one, which that one is more of a true retelling because the situation in that is what if Belle's mother was the enchantress that cursed the beast. So that whole one, we see the entire retelling of Beauty and the Beast. We see Belle meet the beast. We see all of that play out just with this little extra thing added on.
So now that we've kind of described the difference between a retelling versus a reimagining, we are going to break each of these different types down to their core, what really goes into these retellings, and then why these are the most common.
So I think one of the most common ones, which it's very common in literature to see a Cinderella story, but I think it's more common in movies and TV shows. So when we're breaking the Cinderella story down to its bare essentials, what do we have? We have a poor person who most of the time has a stepmom or a stepfather or some kind of malevolent familial figure who is oppressing them in some way, shape, or form. And we have this Cinderella type character who throughout everything kind of remains true to themselves. It's usually they're seen as very kind, and eventually they are rescued from their situation, whether that be someone else helping them, and in that case it's usually some love interest typically that is seen as richer or of a higher standing or more important, etc., etc. Or we see, I think more commonly nowadays with the feminist movement, this Cinderella-esque figure saving themselves.
The first pretty well-known example that we thought about was Ella Enchanted by Gail Carson Levine. Most people know the movie quite well, but it actually was a book first. In this story, Ella is the main character standing in for Cinderella, and she does live with her stepmother and stepsisters. But the twist on this story is that Ella is cursed to always obey by her fairy godmother character. And in the end, another twist is that she kind of ends up saving herself instead of Prince Charmant. But I really love this story. There's so many cool characters that they add into this one. So I do think it's more of a reimagining, even though the plot does follow the original story of Cinderella pretty closely.
I think that's really because of this curse that is put on Ella when she's a baby. That really differentiates it from any other Cinderella retelling I've ever seen. And this whole idea of this curse to obey is something that I think was pretty revolutionary for this book. I've never seen anything like it. I've really never heard of anyone else doing that. When I see it in outside media, something like this happen, I constantly hear it referred to, oh, that's the Ella Enchanted thing. And that's how you know when a book is doing good and original, if something else is referred to as that book or something from that book, because that means it was recognizable and identifiable enough to make that book stand out. So another Cinderella retelling that I think is a little bit more close to the original, but still very, very much expands upon the story, is Cinderella's Dead by Kaylin Bayron. And basically, in this book, the Cinderella story is known, and it is its own story within the book. They have books about Cinderella. And basically, in this story, the Cinderella trope is mandated for everybody. So everybody in this story, I guess those lucky enough to be granted this privilege, get to go through their own Cinderella story, where they meet their own fairy godmother who gives them this wish, and they relive the whole Cinderella experience. But our main character in this is not a fan of that. And so she kind of runs away from the ball before she's ever given a chance to really experience it.
Another example of a reimagining of the Cinderella story is Stepsister by Jennifer Donnelly. This book takes place right after Cinderella is rescued by the prince and is taken to the castle, and it goes into the story of what happens to the evil stepsisters, quote, evil stepsisters, after Cinderella is gone. But I really loved how Jennifer did this story, how it goes into a different character than we're used to seeing a side to. And at the end, it's really cool. The stepsisters actually get reunited with Cinderella. And it's this really cool moment. I won't spoil exactly how it goes, but it's a very interesting reimagining of Cinderella.
One of the loosest Cinderella stories that I've ever come across is Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas, which when I was reading it the first and second time, I didn't realize that it was supposed to be a Cinderella retelling until I was directly told that. And that's because the situation in which the story happens is very loose to the plot of Cinderella. So instead of this poor girl, going to a ball, you have this assassin getting recruited by the crown prince to join basically this assassin competition, which in the end, the whole point is that she does get picked, and that's kind of almost in place of in a traditional Cinderella story where like she's picked by the prince and then she becomes the princess. In this case, it's she beats everybody out in this assassin competition and she becomes the king's head assassin. I would say this one has the least amount of similarities to the original tale. There's a lot of motifs and imagery within it. So this idea of a throne of glass and this palace that a lot of this is taking place in is glass. And so looking back on it, I understand why I didn't pick it up. But also, now that I do understand, I think if I reread it again, I'll really fully get that Cinderella story more.
Also didn't realize that this book was a Cinderella retelling. The last one that we kind of decided was a Cinderella retelling is The Selection by Kiera Cass. At the core of this book, there is a girl who is from a poorer social class, or the caste system, as they call it in this book. In this story, our main character, America, who is the stand-in for Cinderella, is chosen along with 34 other girls to compete in The Selection, which is a competition to see who the prince will marry. And so this is where the kind of Cinderella plot ends. The rest of the plot is very political and is kind of a commentary on social class and how that plays into society.
So the next fairy tale retelling we want to kind of talk about a little bit is Beauty and the Beast, which for me is one of my favorite tropes of all time. So I will try not to go on too long of a tangent. But I think the core ideas of Beauty and the Beast is you have a person who falls in love with another person, and that second person usually is depicted as a monster or a beast, but that doesn't necessarily have to be literal. It can be metaphorical, so it can be in the way they act and treat other people as well. And typically they involve a curse of some sort, but not always. And this story is usually an enemies to lovers. So they start out hating each other and then, fall in love with each other, which I love. And that's probably part of the reason why I love Beauty and the Beast so much. But on to some examples. So one of the more recent ones that I have read is Beastly Beauty by, again, Jennifer Donnelly. She actually writes a lot of fairy tale retelling. So if you're a big fan of fairy tale retellings, definitely check her stuff out because she has a lot and they're usually really good. But in Beastly Beauty, this one follows very closely to the original plot of Beauty and the Beast. But the big difference between this one is it's gender swapped. So Belle in this is a boy named Beau, And the beast, in this case, who is still royalty, is Princess Arabella, or Belle. And this one very much follows your male Belle breaks into the palace. In this one, he's a thief, gets caught, gets thrown in jail. Then the princess, who is under a curse where she turns into a beast and, attacks everybody and everything around her when she's in this state, is trying to find someone to fall in love with her to break the curse. I think it's very unique. A lot of times, I've seen gender swapped retellings, but I feel like it's definitely not common for Beauty and the Beast specifically. And I think me and Adrienne have been jokingly talking about this, but I really do think it's because of kind of this view of women. And I think women are more likely to look past the beastly appearance and look at what's within, which is kind of really the heart of a Beauty and the Beast story, is seeing past the outside and looking within, where in most cases, I don't think men are as likely to do that. And so I think it takes a very specific kind of gender swap story for this to work and in a lot of people's minds be plausible. I'm not saying that men can't do that. I just don't think it's as common, especially in literature and especially in retellings.
It's definitely not as common to see a story written that way, a Beauty and the Beast retelling written that way. I think other ones are a little bit different. Like, for Cinderella, you see many gender-swapped stories of this. So I think that's a good point. The next retelling that we thought of is A Curse So Dark and Lonely by Bridget Kemmerer. This series is, I think, based pretty heavily upon Beauty and the Beast. There's a main character, a girl who is actually from the real world of Washington, D.C., and somehow gets transported to this fantasy world. In this specific story, the prince has been cursed by an enchantress to turn into a monster at the end of every season. But this keeps repeating itself over and over. And the curse only ends when he gets a woman to fall in love with him. And he doesn't want to hurt his own people, so he decides that it's totally okay to hurt people from a different world. And his guard gets the ability to go to the real world of Washington, D.C. and kidnap women. This point is brought up in the book by the main girl character, and the prince kind of denies these allegations of kidnapping and says that the women know what they're getting into and they go willingly, and he chooses women who don't necessarily have a home to go back to, but our main character in this book is accidentally brought to the world. So at the beginning, he's not even trying to get her to fall in love with him, and I think that's what makes the difference, because she does end up falling for him, and eventually the curse is broken, and other plot points ensue.
So another Beauty and the Beast retelling that I think is definitely a little bit more not as faithful to the original is Ogre Enchanted by Gail Carson Levine. And this is meant to actually be a prequel to Ella Enchanted. And the connection between the two is this same fairy godmother character that's kind of placing these, at this point, let's be real, curses on these characters. And in this one, the main character is a woman, and she rejects the feelings of her best friend because she has a crush, I think, on someone else. And so this fairy sees that and feels bad for her friend and is like, oh my gosh, how dare you reject his feelings? You know what? Because you were so mean to this precious little wholesome cinnamon roll of a human being, I'm going to curse you to look like an ogre, and you have to make someone fall in love with you. And if you don't, womp womp, you're going to be an ogre forever. And so that's basically the premises of this story, is she's traveling around the kingdom trying to get someone to fall in love with her.
The last book within this retelling that Autumn and I have both read is A Court of Thorns and Roses series by Sarah J. Maas. In this book, our main character is Feyre, who is the stand-in for Belle, and she ends up killing this Fae. So in revenge, a different Fae kidnaps her. And there is a curse placed on this Fae as well. His name is Tamlin. And eventually Feyre does fall in love with him. And I do think that after this point, that is when the Beauty and the Beast retelling kind of stops. Because after this story, there's much more. And it goes into many other characters besides Tamlin. And you find out that this is not really the fairy tale that it seems to be. And I think that's an interesting part of this series.
I think an interesting point to note about this book is that she does fall in love with Tamlin, who appears to be a beast, but there's a character within the story that everybody treats like a beast, and that's the person who she actually falls for in the end. And I think that's kind of the twist on this trope that we really get into a little bit more is there's more than one love interest and there's more than one definition of beast and what that means. And I personally, I love a Court of Thorns and Roses. And the first book is definitely very heavily inspired by the Beauty and the Beast story, but I do agree with Adrienne that after this first one, we kind of lose all of that.
The third most common fairy tale that we believe gets told the most often is Snow White. The core ideas of this trope is that an evil person, often kind of like Cinderella, is a stepmother or some kind of familial relation, is jealous of either their stepdaughter or other relation, but trying to remove them doesn't work anyway, and they don't get the love or adoration that they so desperately want. More specifically, this trope often involves poison, and then a character being saved from said poison. I think it's very obvious that this one isn't done quite as much as the other two because we could really only think of one book example off the top of our heads, and that is Poisoned, again, by the Jennifer Donnelly. In this book, the main character is a Snow White stand-in named Sophie, and it begins very heavily based on the original Snow White story. She goes into the forest with the queen's huntsman, but the huntsman does end up taking her heart. This story is kind of a struggle within Sophie of her being too kind to rule this kingdom, but after she goes through all these adventures to try and survive being hunted by the queen, she realizes that this kindness is actually a strength. And I think that is one of the biggest things of a Snow White retelling is the kindness and the goodness within a character is important.
So for the rest of these, because we could honestly go on and on and on, and the examples we've given today are strictly ones that either Adrienne and I have read ourselves. So there are tons and tons of other fantastic fairy tale retellings that we just haven't had the chance and the opportunity to read yet. So please, in the comments, tell us your favorite fantasy retelling that we haven't gone over yet. But these last ones that we're going to go over are kind of our miscellaneous. So they're ones that there are definitely several different retellings. There's definitely several books going into this, but these are ones that we didn't have as many examples for, so we put them here. So the first one I'm going to talk about is To Kill a Kingdom by Alexandra Christo, and this is a Little Mermaid retelling, which I didn't realize until Adrienne told me it was. But when I tried to defend why it wasn't, I quickly realized that it 100% was. So basically in this one, you have, instead of a mermaid, you have a siren. And sirens are like mermaids. They have a fish tail, but the big distinction between them is that they kill men. This one, you have your mermaid-esque character who is a princess of the underwater people, basically. And in this story, she gets legs. She becomes human. And in this case, it is not her choice. It is very much not her choice. She does not want that, but that's forced upon her. And she now has to work with the prince, and they're enemies at this point. It's very much an enemies to lovers story, whereas the original Little Mermaid was not. And so this one does a good job of having some of those very same core ideas of it's about a mermaid who transforms into a human, is now on land, and is interacting with a prince. But it does vary differently in mainly the attitude the prince and the siren have towards each other, and a lot of kind of the plot, because in this one, the sirens kill people.
I fear I'm going to go on a very long tangent about this author. One of my personal favorite authors, and one who's also great at writing fairy tale retellings, is Marissa Meyer. The first one I'm going to talk about is her series, The Lunar Chronicles. They are 4 books, and each one has a main character that is based on a different fairy tale, and then they all kind of merge into one amazing, fantastic story. The first one is Cinderella. The main character's name is Cinder. The second one is Little Red Riding Hood, and those main characters are Scarlet and Wolf, which is his street name, technically. The third one is Rapunzel, and the main character's name is Cress. And then the last one is based on Snow White, and this one is Princess Winter. I could talk all day about this story, but there's just so much to it that I would never be able to get through it. But they are originally based on the core principles of these stories, but they are very much reimagined into this world, and then all merging together is definitely not in the original fairy tales. But the Lunar Chronicles is an amazing example of this. It's also important to note that this series is sci-fi versions of the fairy tales instead of fantasy, but I still wanted to talk about it because it's just an amazing example. Another one, also by Marissa Meyer, is Heartless, which is a standalone novel based on the backstory of the Queen of Hearts. In this book, it starts with Catherine, who is the one who is going to become the Queen of Hearts, and she is basically going to be forced into a marriage with the King of Hearts, but she falls in love with Jest instead. And it kind of goes into how she becomes the Queen of Hearts. I really don't want to spoil this one, just because I really want everyone who's listening to this to go read that one, and the twist will have you in tears. So good luck with that. The last one that I can think of by Marissa Meyer also is the Gilded duology, which is based on Rumpelstiltskin. In this series, the main character is actually not the one who Rumpelstiltskin is based on. Her name is Cerilda, and we learned that Cerilda was basically blessed by the god of stories, they think. And so she has these very strange looking eyes, and she seems to lie a lot, which is why the people in her town don't like her very much. But then eventually it turns out that everything she's saying, all the stories she's telling, are coming true. And eventually she goes to this magic castle that's ruled by the king of the dead, and then she finally meets Rumpelstiltskin. And this is actually kind of a friends to lovers trope within this book, and it's just an amazing reimagining of the Rumpelstiltskin story that you wouldn't really expect.
The last one of our other examples that we're going to talk about today is a Hansel and Gretel retelling, because I think a lot of times when we think of fairy tale retellings, we think of the Disney movies because they're so popular. They're something that most people are familiar with as their first experience with these common fairy tales. And there's not a Hansel and Gretel movie. And so it's not one that we associate a lot of times with our childhood as much, but it is one that is still very commonly retold. And the one that I immediately thought of was The Sinister Sweetness of Splendid Academy by Nikki Lofton. And basically this one, our main character is your average middle schooler who starts going to this new school, and everything is a little strange here. The teachers keep encouraging the students to eat all the time, and everything tastes good. Something that I vividly remember from this book is that the characters will just straight up eat a stick of butter because it was delicious, apparently. And the whole reason that these teachers are making them eat all this food all the time is because they're trying to fatten the kids up, because the teachers are witches and they're going to eat the kids, which is very similar to the original Hansel and Gretel of kids get lost in the forest, they wander into a candy house. Basically, most retellings have it as that. And the witch feeds them and feeds them and feeds them with the intent to, cook them and eat them. And then the children in the end, the one that's coming to mind is they like kick the witch into the oven and she dies. And I don't exactly remember how this one ends, but I think it's they fall into this giant pot of soup instead. It's a little bit more PG than I think the original fairy tale, just because this one is definitely made for a younger audience, but it's still very good retelling. So having talked a lot about different specific examples for some specific fairy tale retellings, tropes basically, I think it's important to discuss a little bit about why they're so popular in the first place. Why do we keep retelling the same stories over and over again?
I think one reason is that because these stories are so known, it's easy to tell a story and then have fun shocking the audience with a twist. And I think it's a not necessarily easy way to write stories, but it is a simple one in the fact that you can shock an audience easier by changing up something they already know. I also think it's just the aspect of nostalgia. We all love these stories so much and we grew up with them. So rereading these stories is just a sense of home.
I think another thing from more of a writing standpoint as to why we love to write fairy tale retelling so much is because, not to say that it's by any means easy or easier than writing a traditional novel, but a lot of the heavy lifting is kind of off the writer's shoulders a little bit. We have some things already figured out. There are these core ideas that, as we were talking about, most fairy tale retellings incorporate. Most of them stay true to these specific ideas or some variation of that. So some of the heavy lifting is already done, but that is definitely not to say that it's easier by any means. There's so much creativity involved with doing a fairy tale retelling, almost more so because writers are striving to make it different and to make it stand out and to make it unique and memorable. But I think also a part of it is these are stories that most of us have grown up with. These are stories that we all know. And as a writer, it's really fun to play with these and, mess around and put your own twist on it. It's just a fun writing exercise to do. And if you ever get the chance, sit down, come up with a version of a fairy tale in your own head or write it down. But it's just something that can really get your creative juices flowing. And it's just a really good and fun exercise for writers at any level, because you can make it as easy or as difficult as you want depending on how much of the original fairy tale you want to include.
Thank you all so much for listening. That's it from The Right Angle, where we know the real magic of books is for everyone. Readers, writers, and all those in between.
Until next time, write boldly, read unapologetically,
and stay
weird.
weird.